this is okay, awesome. I'm going to take this out if I can. There we go. Okay, I like this a lot better. Hi. So it's great to see everyone. I'm Dr. Amanda Reiman. I am not a lawyer. I am a social worker and I am a researcher. So I think it's probably good to have a social worker up here because we're all probably a little verklempt right now after these last two presentations. But what do you get when you bring a social worker to talk to a bunch of lawyers? You get some storytelling and you get a little bit of science. So I thought what I would do today is share a bit about my own story and journey in this space. I've been working in cannabis for over 20 years. And really the realization that I came to that helped me understand what we are all up against. Because I'm sure that in your work, probably 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 20 times a day, you look at the policy and you say that just doesn't make sense, given what we know about cannabis. That just doesn't make sense. And so what I wanted to do today was take us back a little bit and talk about how we got here, why things don't make sense. And I'm not going to say we're going to come away with a bunch of answers, but I do think we're going to come away with a renewed dedication to unraveling the decades of propaganda that have led us to this incongruence between science and policy. So, we're going to go back to my childhood. I see that a lot of you recognize this program, DARE, Drug Abuse Resistance Education. So I grew up in the 80s and 90s in the Midwest. This was the only federally funded drug education program that existed. And it was really to help people understand that, 1, drugs were bad, and that 2, people who use drugs, also bad. And really the theme of DARE was Nancy Reagan's mantra of just say no. Not how do we make this safer, how do we protect people, just don't do it. And I was remembering this PSA from when I was younger. Some of you may remember McGruff the crime dog with a whole bunch of children singing users are losers and losers are users. If you don't know it, look it up on YouTube. It's quite interesting. But this did a couple of things, right? One is it said people who use drugs are losers, right? They are bad people. And the second thing it did was say that drug use is a criminal activity. And in this PSA, McGruff the crime dog actually encouraged kids to turn in adults who they saw using drugs, whether that be their parents or teachers or other adults in their life, that by doing that, they were helping to take a fight out of crime. So I was in Indiana at the time. I grew up in Carmel, Indiana, which is in the middle of the state. And after I left high school and went down to the University of Texas at Austin, I met a whole group of people who used drugs. And I did not know many people or any people that used drugs in high school. And one of the things that I recognized, one, was that they were not losers. They were not criminals, but they were being made criminals by a system that had decided that that's who they were. And I saw my friends who were smart and exciting and interesting get caught with drugs, go to jail, get out, and then be impacted by the myriad of collateral sanctions associated with a drug charge. They couldn't get a job, they couldn't get back into school, they couldn't get any kind of public assistance, and they went through this cycle over and over and over again. And unfortunately, many of them did not make it out. Some of them passed away from overdose. Some of them went to jail for very, very long periods of time. And some of them took their own lives. And so I was struck by the incongruence of what I had been taught and what I had experienced. So I ended up failing out of college because I was just so much interested in these people that I wasn't really interested in class. So I moved back to Chicago, where my parents lived. And I started a program in psychology at the University of Illinois, Chicago. And in 1997, when I was a senior, I was in an honors class and I had to write a thesis on something that had to do with drugs. So I decided to write something about DARE. Now, my whole purpose was just to show that DARE was an inadequate program, that the things that they were teaching in DARE were not reality, And this was 1997, so there was like no internet. I mean, there was like a little bit of internet, but really nothing on what we know today. So really the only way to get information about drugs was from the government. I mean, we didn't have all of these websites that were showing us the reality. We really had one source of information, with the exception of DRCnet. So DRCnet was one of the very, very early sites that actually had articles and information from independent sources about drugs. And that is where I found out that not only was DARE ineffective, but we knew it was ineffective. We had research showing that DARE was not only ineffective, but that people who went through the DARE program were actually more likely to use drugs after graduating than people who did not go through the DARE program. Now, this surprised me, but not really. But the thing that really did surprise me was when I learned that scientists and journalists who wanted to get that information out were threatened by the federal government with loss of their job, with loss of their credibility, to keep this status quo alive, to keep this idea that DARE should be the only federally funded drug education program, that it was beneficial, that it was helpful. In order to keep that alive, the research was actively discarded, and people that wanted to get the truth out there were actively threatened. And this really floored me. I was brought up in the Midwest in the 1980s, like we were taught to just trust the government, right? Like they have what's best for you. And if they say something is true, it's because it is. And this really put a whole crack in my belief system. And so I wrote about that for my honors thesis. And then I decided to go to grad school for social work. And in my first year in 1998, they passed the provision to the Higher Education Act that said that if you had a drug felony, you could no longer get federal funding for college. Now again, as a social worker, I knew that one way to help people move out of poverty, to give them opportunity, was to allow them access to higher education. And so here the government was saying, well, except if you use drugs, because then you're a bad person and you don't deserve opportunity. So again, I saw that what I knew from the science on what we needed in order to help communities was actively incongruent with what the policies were around drug use. And around that time in 1998, Students for Sensible Drug Policy formed. And so I got involved with them. I went to their first conference in DC in 1998, and we talked a lot about the Higher Education Act. And we talked a lot about the crack cocaine sentencing disparities. And we talked a lot about collateral sanctions for drug use. And we talked about people getting kicked off welfare because they had drug charges. And we talked about exactly who was going to jail for drugs and how certain communities were being targeted. And this really blew up my world. And after that, I decided that I wanted to dedicate my career to doing the research that needed to be done to expose the hypocrisy in drug policy, and that that's who I was going to be as a social worker. So let's talk a little bit how we even got there. Now, I'm sure that a lot of folks here might be familiar with the very beginnings of cannabis policy, but I'm going to take you back. The turn of the century, in the 1900s, after Mexican independence, we had an influx of immigration into the southern states of the U.S. We also had a thriving jazz music scene in places like New Orleans. And there was a plant, marijuana, that was used culturally by a lot of folks, that had been used culturally by certain communities for thousands of years, that was now being brought into the United States. And as many as you know, and I think it was said very well on Laura's panel earlier, the war on drugs has always been about people. It's always been a war on people. And so drug policy was never, ever, ever about controlling drugs. Drug policy has always, always, always been about controlling people. And it started back in the 1800s in San Francisco, of all places, with the opium laws, Chinese immigration, the police wanting reasons to go into opium dens and to knock on doors and to detain people and to search them and to take away their rights. So they chose their substance that was used in their culture in order to demonize that population. Well, in the 1900s, the government took a page out of that book and started to do the same thing with Mexican immigration and marijuana. But see, here was the problem. Cannabis was already a very commonly found medicine at this point. Eli Lilly, Bristol Myers Squibb, they all made medicines with cannabis. So you had these white folks in the US who all had cannabis in their medicine cabinets, but the government needed to convince them that what was happening in Texas was different, that this was a different plant with a different outcome, and that it wasn't the same, because otherwise the states were never going to agree to let the federal government take over their drug laws. They were not going to just acquiesce and say, we'll do whatever you want. They had to be scared. Fear is a very strong driver. So they started a propaganda campaign. Now, what is propaganda? Propaganda is basically making someone feel something about an issue based on emotion. So it's like that feeling rather than that thinking. And propaganda is very, very strong and very, very hard to undo, as we will talk about. So the propaganda campaign around cannabis really focused on this idea that cannabis consumers are crazy, lazy, dangerous, stupid, incompetent, and untrustworthy. Now again, I mean, you thought 1997 was early internet. We're talking about the 1900s, where people really only got their news through the radio, maybe a newspaper. So when you read a newspaper in Chicago that told you about a Mexican person in Texas that murdered their entire family because they were all hopped up on marijuana, you really didn't have, there was no Snopes. Like, you couldn't go and say, is this really true? You believed it. And when I was doing my dissertation work at Berkeley, which has one of the most fabulous library systems in the world, they had the original transcripts from the 1937 Marijuana Tax Act hearings. So the hearings that actually decided for the first time that the federal government was going to have a hand in regulating marijuana. So I read those hearings, and oh my gosh, you guys, it reads like something from like the trashiest website you've ever read. I mean, it's ridiculous that people even believed it. These stories of violence and these stories of how marijuana was ruining entire communities because of who the consumers were and what cannabis did to those consumers. So we had this huge propaganda campaign. We had Reefer Madness, right, in the 1930s, the movie, where people are crazy and they jump out of windows and play piano really fast because they're using marijuana. And we had laws that came out of that because the states were like, oh my gosh, we are so terrified. Please, federal government, do whatever. They just laid down. And they were like, do whatever you want to do with drug laws because we are terrified of what this is going to do to our communities. And that is how we ended up with policies based on fear rather than reality and based on feelings rather than science. So this is my favorite slide. So this is what it looks like. This is what we're dealing with, right? So we're at the top, cannabis policy, right? We're all trying to come up with rational policies that take into account public health and safety, that take into account the impact of prohibition on communities of color. But this is what it's built on, right? This is what's underneath. And it's still this idea that cannabis consumers are drug dealers, that they're criminals, that they're crazy, that they're lazy, that they're Woody Harrelson with a bomb. But these ideas is what spawned what we have today. This is what we're dealing with. So when we're trying to advocate for policies that make sense, we have to remember that this is what they are built upon. So if you think of like a garden hose, right? And it's all jumbled together and it's all kind of in knots and you can see the end of the hose and you can see the spigot. But unless you undo that hose with all of the knots, you're not going to get a full stream. And so we're in the position, we didn't make the knots. We did not make that hose the way it is, but we're responsible in a lot of ways for undoing it. Because if we ever want to have policies that are rational, that are based on science, that actually reflect the plants and the consumers and the society, we can't do it with this jumble of propaganda underneath. So I'm going to talk about 3 examples of where the science and the policy are not congruent. And one is going to deal with the plant, and one is going to deal with consumers, and one is going to deal with society. So first, let's talk about the plant. So one of the biggest issues in the cannabis industry today is environmental waste. And that waste comes from cultivation, but it also comes from packaging. Anybody that's from the Bay Area, I used to argue that the streets of Oakland were littered with doob tubes, which are the plastic tubes that pre-rolls come in. Depending on the state, the regulations differ slightly, but we do not see people being able to take their own reusable jars into the dispensary like an herb store and get cannabis flower, put in those jars, weighed out, and leave. That would be the most sustainable option. But no, we see grams of cannabis in like 3 layers of plastic with child-proof tops that are completely wasteful. So why? Well, there's this belief that cannabis flower poses a risk to children and that it needs to be protected through child-proof packaging. But here's the science. Cannabis flower is not intoxicating as raw bud. It's THCA, it's the acid form of THC. In order for THC to be intoxicating, it needs to be decarboxylated, which means heat has to be added to it, and then it becomes THC. Now, some of this decarbing does happen under the light source, but not enough to cause intoxication. So if a child were to put a bud in their mouth, which they probably spit out because they don't taste very good, they're not going to get high from it. So again, this fear about the plant, like the literal fear of the cannabis plant, causes us to have these policies that are actually very damaging, and in this case, damaging to the environment. So looking at all of the calls to California poison control in 2021, 17% were related to dry flower, and that was mostly roaches. So roaches, the end of the joint, those are intoxicating because it's been lit on fire, right? So the weed in the end of that roach could be intoxicating, but 63% of those calls were for edibles. So why are we treating them the same? Right? Why are we demanding the same kind of packaging for flower as we are for edibles when we know that they don't pose the same kind of risk? We don't know why. We just do it because we feel that it's dangerous. And we feel that it's dangerous because propaganda has taught us that. All right, now let's look at consumers. So here's the belief that is reflected in the law. Cannabis consumers pose a threat to society. Cannabis consumers are liabilities at work and as parents. Cannabis consumers cannot responsibly own guns. That's what the policies say, right? And those policies are in rules like you cannot be a cannabis consumer and own a gun. The fact that cannabis can be used in custody battles and custody hearings as reasons to deny people the ability to adopt a child. That you can get fired from your job, even if you're a licensed medical cannabis patient. But the reality is we have no evidence of this. 0 evidence of this. In fact, there was a study that came out a little while ago that showed that medical cannabis laws are actually associated with higher workforce participation because people who will be taking sick days because of chronic illness are actually able to go to work during the day because they have access to cannabis. We have no evidence that cannabis is a danger to children if a parent is consuming cannabis, and we definitely have no evidence that cannabis use is linked to irresponsible gun use. But this goes back to Mexican immigration. This goes back to the story that the government had to tell in order to get the states to agree to let them do whatever they wanted with cannabis laws. And in order to maintain that story, they need to maintain the idea that cannabis consumers cannot be trusted, that we cannot hold jobs, that we should not have kids. And so again, the belief that's reflected in the law is not reflective of reality. And then finally, one of my favorite things to talk about, excise taxes. So excise taxes are sin taxes, as we like to call them. And one of the goals of excise taxes is to basically fund the harm to society that comes from a certain behavior. So we look at alcohol sin taxes and tobacco sin taxes. These are to cover things like people who get emphysema and don't have health insurance. people that get into DUIs and don't have insurance, people that get into assaults and medical bills have to be paid. These are all related to why we have excise taxes. And as you all know, the excise taxes on cannabis are really high, way higher than they need to be, based on what harm cannabis actually poses to society. So the belief that's reflected in the law is that cannabis creates a very high level of harm to society, and that we need to have the high taxes to dissuade use and to cover societal costs. But what does the science say? So there was recently a great review that came out from Manthe et al. Just came out a few weeks ago, actually. And these are German folks, and they decided, because Germany is looking at adult use legalization, they decided to do a review of what actually happens when cannabis is legalized. And it's a really great paper. But what they found is that high-risk youth use remains unchanged, right? And in some places, we actually see youth use decline after legalization. They found that legalization results in a reduction in the illicit market, not as much as we'd like, but we're working on that. A large decline in arrest rates. So while, even with this decline in arrest rates, we still see Black and brown people arrested more frequently than white people, the overall number of arrest rates has declined significantly, and there's been little immediate impact on health indicators. DUI, kind of mixed results. There was a study that came out not too long ago that confirmed what a lot of us know, which is that people that use cannabis regularly drive more safely on cannabis than people who use occasionally, right? It's those once in a while people that have the most trouble driving after use, where your daily consumers actually drive pretty much like sober people. We've seen no increase in cannabis use disorder, no impact on things like cannabis hypermesis, psychosis, or self-harm. And on the other side of it, we have seen a reduction in harms from synthetic cannabinoids. So not only does legalization not create societal harm, it actually has the potential to reduce harms from society by people choosing cannabis instead of things like opiates and instead of things like synthetic cannabinoids or some of the hemp-derived cannabinoids that we're seeing on the market now. So do the excise taxes that we're setting at 15%, 16%, 20%, are they justified based on the science? No, absolutely not. But there they are. And again, a lot of it is this belief that regulators and legislators and other decision makers have about what the impact of cannabis use actually is. So, where do we go from here? I hope you guys know, because I don't really know. I kind of know. So first, we need sound, valid research. Now, my question here is this even possible? There was a time when NIDA funded about 80% of the world's drug research. So when people say, well, why can't you just go do these studies in other countries? Well, we fund those studies. And also, when another country like Israel decides they're going to fund their own research, we say, oh, well, but we're different. We're America. We can't take any of that research that's being done in other places and generalize it to America. So we do need independent, sound, valid research. Now, a shining light in this area is that a lot of legalization laws include money for research. So in California, they just awarded millions of dollars to public universities in California to do research on cannabis. In the past couple years, we've seen the NIDA monopoly on cannabis start to dissolve. So there was a time when the only source of cannabis for research was the University of Mississippi. It was horrible cannabis. It was nothing like what people were buying in dispensaries. And the government completely controlled it. So no one else even could access cannabis to do research on unless they were being funded by the government. And let me tell you, the research that the government was funding on cannabis was not, oh, let's see how helpful this is and if it really deserves these harsh laws. No. All the government was funding was research on how cannabis was dangerous, how it was addictive, and how to keep it out of the hands of teenagers. So we really have to start with the ability to even do the research that shows the incongruence. The research will show us that cannabis consumers are normal people. They use cannabis with intention. Most use non-problematically, with little negative impact on society. And maybe that will give us policies based on science and reality. But see, here's the rub. You go back to propaganda and how propaganda operates. It doesn't let people use their heads. It relies on them responding with what's in here. And even though we have a lot of up-and-coming regulators and legislators who are from a time where they barely remember cannabis prohibition, and having them say that someone is a bad person just because they use cannabis is like someone from my generation saying someone is a bad person just because they drink wine. So we are starting to see that shift happen, and that's good. And we're also starting to see older members of Congress, leaving and moving on, and they're the ones that are really impacted still by prohibition. I mean, they grew up during a time when they were told repeatedly that people who use cannabis are bad people who cannot be trusted, and they believed it. And in fact, if any of you have heard a legislator who was previously against medical cannabis but has changed their mind, the story's always the same, and it goes like this. I was firmly against medical cannabis, but then my brother, sister, mother, self, neighbor, teacher got XYZ disease, and cannabis really helped them. And I'm thinking, okay, that's an N=1 study where in research we don't really count that as real, and I have all of this data I've been giving you for decades. Dianne Feinstein, I'm going to say it, because I've been giving her data for decades about why cannabis isn't as harmful as you think it is, and all it takes is that one person close to them, and they completely change their mind. And that, folks, is how propaganda works. Because they're not changing their mind because they have like this aha moment because they see the data and they see the research and they know it's really true. They're having that aha moment because something changes in here. And that's how propaganda works. So that might seem like, for a group of people that really rely on facts and information, like a pretty sad state of affairs. But my message to you is that you are all some of the smartest, brightest people working on this issue. And you all know what the reality is, and you know what the facts are. And so my hope is that we come away today with a better understanding of what we're up against, and a better understanding of why the mismatch has happened, and maybe a little bit more leniency with why it takes so long to change somebody's mind. And that sometimes we shouldn't even bother. And I hate to say that because I always like to think, oh, if you just got me in a room with that, like Kevin Savet, if you just got me in a room with him for like 15 minutes, I could change his mind. But you know what? We can't change everybody's mind. What we have to do is keep calling out this hypocrisy. And we have to keep reminding people why it's that way, right? So we have to keep reminding people that, look, you feel that this cannabis needs to be taxed at 20% because you've been told a story about how harmful cannabis is, a story that just isn't true. And so as long as we keep calling that out and keep advocating for policies that are based in reality, that are based on science, that are based on the actual human experience of cannabis instead of this story that we've been telling ourselves since the early 1900s, and these legislators keep getting old and keep moving out of positions of power, and we have people coming up who understand cannabis and don't understand prohibition or why we ever had it, that's really what's going to get us there, but that's going to take time. So I hope that you all keep fighting for this cause and keep using your smarts and your brilliance and everything that you have to make sure that we can untangle that hose. Because let me tell you, we can still keep piling policies on top of the propaganda, but it's never, ever, ever going to be enough. If we really want to go into a future where cannabis is treated the way it should be treated, in policy, in community, we have to undo the damage that has been done. We have to remind people that these policies were generated to control people that we wanted to control as America, and that we used this control in order to push policies through that were going to benefit a select few, and that's mostly law enforcement and the private prison system. So, I think that's all I have. I really appreciate your time.